The champagne flute trembled in my hand as my husband of 20 years raised his glass to the crowd of 75 guests scattered across our backyard pavilion. The string lights cast a golden glow over familiar faces, friends who'd celebrated every milestone with us, family who'd watched our love story unfold since college. David's voice carried across the manicured gardens as he began what I thought would be a toast to our marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate 20 incredible years, he said, his smile bright and practiced. But before we toast to the past, I want to introduce you to my future, the woman who's shown me what real love actually feels like. My blood turned to ice as a young Asian woman stepped forward from the crowd, her hand sliding into his with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Stephanie Chen, his interior designer, the one he'd told me was just helping with the office renovation. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, confusion rippling through our anniversary party like a stone thrown into still water. Stephanie and I have been together for 8 months, David continued, his arm now wrapped around her waist. She's helped me realize that what Jess and I had was comfortable, but it wasn't love. Not the kind that sets your soul on fire. I stood frozen in my black cocktail dress, the one I'd spent 3 hours choosing, watching my husband publicly destroy our marriage in front of everyone we knew. But what David didn't know was that in my purse sat a small velvet box, and inside that box was the 7th engagement ring he'd bought me. 7 rings for 7 affairs, each one more expensive than the last, each one his guilty attempt to buy my silence after I'd discovered another betrayal. Tonight the silence ends. The transformation of our backyard into an anniversary celebration had taken weeks of planning. Blackstone Events had arrived at dawn to string thousands of tiny lights between the oak trees that David's grandfather had planted 50 years ago when the Parker family first bought this estate in Westfield. White roses cascaded from every surface, their petals scattered across the stone pathway that led from our colonial mansion to the pavilion where a jazz trio played softly in the corner. I'd chosen every detail myself, from the menu featuring David's favorite lobster bisque to the playlist that included our wedding song. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent 3 months orchestrating the perfect setting for my own public humiliation. But then again, I'd been orchestrating the perfect life for David Parker for 2 decades, so why should tonight be any different? Our guests represented the careful social architecture we'd built together in Connecticut's affluent suburbs. Mark Thompson, David's business partner, stood near the bar with his wife Sandra, both of them looking like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog. My sister Amy had driven down from Milford with her husband and twins, her eyes bright with excitement for what she thought would be a romantic evening celebrating enduring love. Rachel Martinez, my best friend since our kids were toddlers, held court near the appetizer table, her infectious laugh carrying across the garden as she told stories about our college days. Even David's mother Patricia had made the drive from her Beacon Hill townhouse, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her navy Chanel suit a subtle reminder that old money never shouts. She'd given me her grandmother's pearl necklace as a wedding gift 20 years ago, and I wore it tonight like armor, the cool weight against my throat a reminder of everything I stood to lose. The children moved through the party with the easy confidence of teenagers who'd grown up in this rarefied world. Our daughter Emma, 16 and stunning in a way that reminded me of myself at that age, chatted animatedly with our neighbor's son about their upcoming senior year at Westfield Preparatory Academy. Tyler, 14 and all elbows and earnestness, was showing his cousin the new basketball hoop David had installed last month, back when he was still pretending to be a devoted family man. David himself had been the perfect host all evening, working the crowd with the natural charisma that had first attracted me when we met at the University of Connecticut 23 years ago. He'd filled out since then, his once lean frame now soft around the middle despite his expensive personal trainer, his dark hair silvering at the temples in a way that his barber carefully maintained. His success in real estate development had given him an easy confidence, the kind that comes from always having enough money to solve any problem. What the guests couldn't see was the careful choreography beneath the surface, the way David's eyes never quite met mine when he handed me a glass of wine, the way he checked his phone constantly throughout dinner, the way Stephanie Chen had lingered after the other business associates from Parker and Thompson Development had arrived. She'd been introduced simply as one of our talented designers, but I'd noticed how her gaze followed David's movements, how she laughed just a beat too long at his jokes, how she wore a silk dress in David's favorite shade of emerald green. I'd been watching Stephanie for months, actually, ever since I'd discovered her business card in David's jacket pocket along with a receipt for dinner at Le Bernardin, the same restaurant where he'd proposed to me 21 years ago. It was his signature move, recycling romantic gestures with new women, as if love were a marketing campaign that could be replicated with minor adjustments to the target demographic. The catering staff moved through the party with practiced efficiency, refilling champagne glasses and clearing empty plates, their black uniforms allowing them to blend into the background of our carefully curated evening. I'd worked with Blackstone Events for years, hosting fundraisers for the children's school and charity galas for the Junior League. Tonight felt different though, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with celebration and everything to do with the reckoning I'd been planning for 7 years. The jazz trio transitioned into The Way You Look Tonight, and several couples moved to the improvised dance floor on the stone patio. David extended his hand to me with the smile he'd perfected for public consumption, the one that suggested we were the kind of couple who still danced after 20 years of marriage. I took his hand because refusing would have caused the kind of scene I wasn't ready for, not yet. As we swayed together under the lights, his cologne mixing with the scent of roses and summer evening air, David leaned close to my ear. "You've outdone yourself tonight, Jess. Everything looks perfect." His voice carried the warmth he'd always used when he wanted something from me, the same tone he'd used when asking me to use my grandmother's inheritance for the down payment on this house, the same voice that had convinced me to quit my job as a jewelry appraiser so I could focus on support.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Supporting his career and raising our children. "I'm glad you're enjoying it," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm building in my chest. I wanted tonight to be memorable. The song ended and we separated, David's attention immediately caught by Mark Thompson's wave from across the garden. As he walked away, I noticed how his gaze swept the crowd until it found Stephanie, how his expression softened when their eyes met, how she touched her throat in a gesture that seemed intimate even from a distance. Rachel appeared at my side, her dark eyes concerned. "You okay, An? You look a little pale." "Just tired," I said, forcing a smile. "You know how these parties are, all the planning, and then it's over in a flash." But even as I spoke the words, I knew tonight was just beginning. In my purse, wrapped in black velvet, sat the evidence of David's betrayals. 7 engagement rings, each one more expensive than the last, each one purchased after I'd confronted him with proof of another affair. The first had come in 2015, when I'd found texts on his phone from a client named Miranda. The second in 2017, after the weekend business trip to Miami that turned out to be a romantic getaway with his secretary. The third, fourth, and fifth had followed in quick succession as David's infidelities became less careful and more frequent. Each time, he'd cried, apologized, sworn it meant nothing, promised it would never happen again. And each time, he'd presented me with a stunning ring, as if diamonds could erase betrayal, as if carat weight could measure the depth of his remorse. I'd accepted them all, played the role of the forgiving wife, the understanding partner who knew that successful men sometimes strayed but always came home. What David didn't know was that I'd had every ring professionally appraised by my former colleagues at Heritage Gems and Appraisals. I'd photographed each one, documented the purchase dates, saved every receipt and certificate of authenticity. I'd built a case against my own marriage one betrayal at a time, collecting evidence with the methodical precision of someone who understood that in Connecticut's divorce courts, documentation was everything. The most recent ring, number 7, sat heavy in my purse tonight. David had given it to me just 3 weeks ago, after I'd accidentally discovered his hotel reservation for the Hamptons weekend he'd supposedly spent at a real estate conference. The ring was a stunning 5-carat emerald-cut diamond, surrounded by smaller stones, worth approximately $35,000 according to my former mentor at Heritage Gems. It was also, I'd learned through careful research, identical to a ring David had been looking at online for the past 2 months, bookmarked on his laptop right next to Stephanie's Pinterest board for engagement ring inspiration. The realization had hit me like a physical blow. David wasn't just cheating with Stephanie, he was planning to marry her. The ring in my purse wasn't another guilt offering to keep me quiet, it was a practice run, a rehearsal for the proposal he was planning to give to someone else. That's when I'd started planning tonight's revelation. Not the anniversary party itself, but the moment of truth that would follow David's inevitable public betrayal. Because I knew him well enough after 20 years to predict exactly how this would unfold. David's ego wouldn't allow him to simply ask for a divorce. He needed to be the victim, the man who'd finally found true love after years of settling for something less. He needed an audience for his grand gesture, witnesses to his romantic awakening. So I'd given him the perfect stage. Our anniversary party, surrounded by everyone whose opinion mattered to him, everyone who'd admired our supposedly perfect marriage for 2 decades. I'd made it easy for him to destroy me publicly, because I knew that the higher he built his platform, the farther he'd have to fall when I pulled it out from under him. The evening air carried the sound of laughter and conversation, the clink of glasses, and the soft music that had been the soundtrack to so many parties at our home. But underneath it all, I could hear something else. The ticking of time running out on the life I'd built, the marriage I'd protected, the illusion I'd maintained for 20 years. David was still working the crowd, his arm now casually draped around Stephanie's shoulders as he introduced her to various guests. I watched Patricia's face tighten with confusion and disapproval, saw Amy exchange worried glances with her husband, noticed how Rachel's protective instincts had kicked in as she positioned herself closer to me. The moment was coming. I could feel it building like pressure before a storm, the way the air gets thick and charged before lightning strikes. David was moving toward the center of the pavilion, Stephanie glowing beside him, his practiced smile growing wider as he prepared to deliver what he undoubtedly thought would be the performance of his lifetime. I touched the velvet box in my purse one more time, feeling the weight of 7 rings, 7 betrayals, 7 years of carefully documented evidence. Then I smoothed my black dress, straightened my grandmother's pearls, and prepared to watch my husband destroy our marriage in front of everyone we knew. What he didn't realize was that I'd already built the weapon that would destroy him right back. The shift in the party's energy was subtle at first, like the way shadows lengthened just before sunset. David's toast had ended with polite but confused applause, and now conversations resumed in hushed tones as guests tried to process what they'd witnessed. I moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting sympathetic touches on my arm and concerned whispers with the same composure I'd perfected during 20 years of charity events and school fundraisers. "Jess, honey, are you all right?" Sandra Thompson appeared at my elbow, her voice carefully modulated but her eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from watching someone's life implode in real time. Sandra had always been kind to me, but her loyalty ultimately belonged to her husband Mark, David's business partner, which meant her sympathy had limits. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice carrying the calm authority I'd learned from years of managing crisis situations at the children's school. "David's just had a bit too much champagne. You know how he gets when he's excited about a new project." The lie rolled off my tongue easily because I'd been telling variations of it for years. David's drinking, David's stress, David's workload, always something external to explain away behavior that grew more erratic and cruel with each passing year. I'd become an expert at providing cover stories for a man who no longer bothered to create his own. Sandra's relief was visible as she accepted my explanation, her social programming kicking in to smooth over the awkwardness. Of course, men and their grand gestures, right? Mark once surprised me with a trip to Vegas on our anniversary, and forgot to mention he'd booked separate rooms because he was planning to give me all night. I smiled and nodded, playing my part in the elaborate theater of denial that kept polite society functioning. But across the garden, I could see the performance continuing to unravel. David had his arm around Stephanie's waist as he introduced her to my sister Amy, whose face had gone pale with understanding. Rachel stood nearby, her protective instincts clearly activated as she watched the scene with the sharp attention of someone calculating angles of attack. Patricia Parker, David's mother, had positioned herself near the bar with the strategic precision of a general surveying a battlefield. At 73, she'd witnessed enough social disasters to recognize one in progress, and her expression suggested she was already formulating damage control strategies. Patricia had never fully approved of me, considering my middle-class background insufficient for her son's ambitions, but she understood the value of appearances and the cost of public embarrassment. "Jessica dear," Patricia's voice carried the aristocratic chill she reserved for moments of extreme displeasure. "I wonder if we might have a word inside." The request wasn't really a request, and I followed her into the house through the French doors that led to our formal living room. The space felt eerily quiet after the garden party chatter, filled with antiques Patricia had helped us select and artwork we'd purchased at charity auctions to signal our cultural sophistication. Everything in the room spoke of old money stability and traditional values, which made the current situation feel even more surreal. What exactly is David thinking? Patricia's composure cracked slightly, revealing the steel beneath her cultivated gentility. This is completely unacceptable behavior for a Parker. We don't air our personal difficulties in public, and we certainly don't humiliate our wives at anniversary celebrations. I studied her face, noting the way her concern centered entirely on family reputation rather than my emotional well-being. Patricia had always viewed me as an employee rather than a daughter-in-law. Someone hired to maintain David's domestic life and produce presentable grandchildren. My feelings were irrelevant as long as I performed my duties adequately. I'm not sure what's gotten into him, I said, maintaining the facade of bewildered wife, even though I knew exactly what had gotten into him. Stephanie Chen had gotten into him, along with 5 other women over the past 7 years, each affair marking another step in his evolution from careless husband to callous predator. Well, something needs to be done immediately. Patricia continued, her voice sharpening. Mark Thompson is out there trying to explain this disaster to potential investors, and I have friends from the club watching my son make a fool of himself with some girl young enough to be his daughter. Through the window, we could see David and Stephanie on the stone patio, her head tilted back in laughter at something he'd whispered in her ear. The intimacy between them was obvious and deliberate, designed to signal to everyone present that this wasn't a momentary indiscretion, but an established relationship. David had always been theatrical in his romances, even with me in the beginning, but there was something particularly cruel about the way he was performing this one. Perhaps you could speak with him, I suggested, knowing that Patricia's opinion still carried weight with David despite his success. He might listen to you about maintaining family dignity. Patricia's laugh was sharp and humorless. My dear David stopped listening to me about anything meaningful years ago. Success has made him reckless, and reckless men destroy everything they touch if they're not properly managed. The words hung between us, heavy with implication. Patricia understood exactly what kind of man her son had become, but her concern remained focused on containing the damage rather than preventing it. I'd learned over the years that the Parker family's approach to problems was always about management rather than resolution, control rather than change. We returned to the garden to find the party continuing in an atmosphere of forced normalcy. Conversations had resumed, but with the artificial brightness of people pretending everything was fine while secretly memorizing details to share later. The catering staff continued their service with professional discretion, but I caught their meaningful glances, and knew our family drama would be discussed in detail once they returned to their company. Emma and Tyler had apparently been informed of the situation by well-meaning relatives, because they now stood together near the rose garden, with expressions of teenage mortification. At 16, Emma possessed enough social awareness to understand the implications of her father's public betrayal, while Tyler's 14-year-old confusion was written clearly across his face. They'd grown up believing in their parents' marriage as an unshakable foundation, and watching that foundation crumble in real time was clearly overwhelming. I approached them with the same calm I'd used to explain childhood disappointments and teenage heartbreaks, drawing on 20 years of maternal experience to guide them through this crisis. Dad's going through a difficult time right now, I said, pulling them both close. Sometimes adults make poor decisions when they're confused about what they want. Is he leaving us? Tyler's voice cracked slightly, hovering between childhood and adolescence in the way that always made my heart ache. Is that lady going to be our new mom? The directness of children could be devastating in its clarity. Tyler had cut through all the adult euphemisms and social conventions to ask the questions that mattered. Emma remained silent, but her hand found mine, and squeezed tightly, seeking reassurance I wasn't sure I could provide. Nothing's been decided yet, I told them honestly. But whatever happens, you'll always be my children, and I'll always take care of you. David chose that moment to appear, his face flushed with champagne, and the kind of manic energy that comes from burning bridges in spectacular fashion. There you are, he said, his voice too loud and too bright. Stephanie was hoping to meet the kids properly. The presumption in his words hit me like a physical blow. He'd moved from public humiliation to active replacement without missing a beat, already integrating his mistress into our family dynamic as if the past 20 years were simply a rough draft he was ready to revise. Stephanie approached with the careful smile of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. She was beautiful in the way that 28-year-old women often were, with smooth skin and bright eyes unmarked by decades of compromise and disappointment. Her emerald dress was perfectly tailored, her jewelry tasteful but expensive, her entire presentation carefully calculated to suggest both success and availability. Emma and Tyler right, she said, her voice warm but uncertain. Your dad talks about you constantly. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Emma's response was a masterclass in teenage passive aggression. "That's nice," she said, her tone polite but cold. "Dad's never mentioned you at all." The silence that followed was excruciating, filled with the kind of tension that makes everyone present wish they were anywhere else. David's face darkened with embarrassment and anger, while Stephanie's smile became increasingly strained. I felt a surge of pride in Emma's instinctive loyalty, even as I recognized the danger of antagonizing David when he was in this volatile state. "Emma," I said quietly, "why don't you and Tyler go check on your grandmother? She was looking for you earlier." They left gratefully, and I was alone with David and Stephanie for the first time all evening. The three of us stood in a triangle of barely contained hostility, surrounded by the party that was supposed to celebrate my marriage, but had instead become its funeral. "The children are upset," I said to David, my voice carefully neutral. "This isn't the right way to handle things." "There is no right way," David replied, his earlier charm completely gone. "I've been miserable for years, Jess. I stayed because of the kids, and because I thought I owed it to you, but I can't pretend anymore. Stephanie makes me feel alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible." The speech had the rehearsed quality of something he'd practiced, probably in front of Stephanie's bathroom mirror, while she got ready for dates that should have been mine. David had always been good at convincing himself that his selfishness was actually nobility, that his betrayals were acts of honesty rather than cruelty. "And you thought our anniversary party was the appropriate venue for this revelation?" I asked, allowing a note of incredulity to enter my voice. Stephanie shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that she'd been cast in a role she hadn't fully understood. "David said you and he had discussed this," she said hesitantly, "that you knew about us, and were okay with making it public." The lie was so audacious that I almost laughed. David had managed to convince his mistress that I was a willing participant in my own humiliation, that our marriage had been so amicably dissolved, that I'd happily host the party announcing his new relationship. It was manipulation on a level that required genuine sociopathy. "I see," I said, my voice betraying nothing of the fury building in my chest. David has always been creative with the truth. The evening continued around us, but we'd created a bubble of awkwardness that seemed to repel other guests. I could see people watching us from across the garden, their conversations pausing as they tried to read the dynamics playing out in real time. Rachel had positioned herself at the edge of the patio with the strategic awareness of someone prepared to intervene if necessary, while Amy looked ready to march over and demand explanations. But I wasn't ready for interventions or explanations. I was ready for David to finish what he'd started, to complete his transformation from unfaithful husband to public embarrassment. Because every word he spoke, every casual cruelty he displayed, was adding to the case I'd been building against him for 7 years. The velvet box in my purse felt heavier with each passing moment, weighted with the evidence of his systematic betrayals, and the documentation that would destroy him in divorce court. 7 rings for 7 affairs, each one professionally appraised and legally documented, each one proof of his pattern of infidelity and financial manipulation. David excused himself to get another drink, leaving Stephanie and me alone in a moment of uncomfortable intimacy. She looked younger up close, her confidence wavering now that she was separated from David's protective presence. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know this must be difficult for you." David said you two had grown apart, that you were both ready to move on. "David says many things," I replied, studying her face for signs of genuine malice, but finding only the kind of naive self-interest that made young women easy targets for men like my husband. "How long have you known he was married?" The question caught her off guard, and I saw truth flicker across her features before she could hide it. "He told me about you right away," she said, but the slight hesitation in her voice suggested otherwise. "He said you were more like roommates than spouses, that you stayed together for convenience." Another lie, another manipulation, designed to absolve David of responsibility, while making his betrayal seem like an act of liberation rather than destruction. I'd heard variations of this story from the wives of other cheating husbands over the years. The elaborate justifications that allowed mistresses to sleep peacefully while participating in the destruction of families. "And you believed him?" I asked, genuine curiosity in my voice. Stephanie's composure cracked slightly. "I wanted to believe him," she admitted. "He made it sound like he was trapped in a marriage that had died years ago, like staying with you was actually cruel to both of you." The honesty in her answer surprised me, and for a moment I saw past the designer dress and calculated charm to the insecure young woman underneath. David had targeted her with the same precision he used in his real estate deals, identifying her vulnerabilities and exploiting them with promises of love and security.
But my sympathy had limits. Stephanie had made choices, regardless of David's manipulation, and those choices had consequences that extended far beyond her own life. My children would carry the scars of tonight for years, their trust in their father permanently damaged by his public betrayal of their family. David returned with fresh drinks, and the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that suggested he'd spent his time at the bar steeling himself for whatever came next. The party was beginning to wind down naturally, guests making polite excuses about early mornings and long drives home. But core family members remained, trapped by obligation and morbid curiosity to see how this disaster would conclude. "I think it's time we made this official," David announced, his voice carrying across the garden with the authority he'd perfected in business meetings. "I wanted everyone here tonight, because you're the people who matter most to us, and I wanted you to witness something important."
Blood turned cold as I realized what was about to happen. David wasn't content with simply announcing his new relationship. He was planning to propose to Stephanie at our anniversary party in front of our children and friends, using our celebration as the backdrop for his next performance. The crowd gathered expectantly, drawn by the promise of drama and the terrible fascination of watching someone's life implode in real time. David dropped to one knee in front of Stephanie, pulling a ring box from his jacket pocket with theatrical flourish. "Stephanie Chen," he said, his voice carrying the same romantic intensity he'd once used with me, "you've shown me what it means to truly love and be loved. Will you marry me?" The ring he presented was stunning, a brilliant cut diamond surrounded by emeralds that caught the light from the string lanterns and threw rainbow patterns across the stone patio. It was also, I realized with crystal clarity, nearly identical to ring number 7 in my purse, the guilt offering he'd given me just 3 weeks ago after I'd discovered his weekend in the Hamptons. Stephanie's gasp of surprise seemed genuine, but I caught the slight tremor in her hands that suggested she'd been expecting this moment. David had probably planned every detail with her, choreographing his proposal to maximize the emotional impact while ensuring she was prepared to accept gracefully. "Yes," she whispered, then louder as David slipped the ring onto her finger. "Yes, of course, yes." The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain, a mixture of genuine congratulations from those who didn't understand the situation and horrified silence from family members who did. Patricia's face had gone ashen with rage, while Amy looked ready to physically assault my soon-to-be ex-husband. But I felt something unexpected wash over me as I watched David seal his new engagement with a passionate kiss. Not heartbreak or rage, but relief. Pure, crystalline relief that my 20-year performance as the understanding wife was finally over, because now I could stop pretending to forgive and start planning to destroy him. Part 3, the triggering event and mission declaration. The silence that followed David's proposal stretched like a taut wire across our anniversary party, vibrating with tension that threatened to snap at any moment. I stood frozen in place, watching my husband of 20 years kiss another woman while wearing the engagement ring that should have been mine, surrounded by family and friends who had no idea how to process the social catastrophe unfolding before them. Patricia Parker was the first to break, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable quiet with the sharp precision of a blade. "David Matthew Parker, what on earth do you think you're doing?" The use of his full name carried the weight of childhood authority, and for a moment David looked like the little boy who'd been caught stealing cookies rather than the successful businessman who'd just publicly destroyed his family. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the defensive arrogance that had become his default response to criticism. "I'm following my heart, Mother," he replied, his arm tightening around Stephanie's waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Something I should have done years ago instead of staying in a marriage that was making everyone miserable. The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. Not content with proposing to another woman at our anniversary party, David was now rewriting our entire marriage as a favor he'd done me by staying. 20 years of shared history, 2 children, a life built together through countless small compromises and large sacrifices, all dismissed as a mistake he'd finally corrected, making everyone miserable. Amy's voice rose above the murmur of shocked conversations, her protective instincts overriding social convention. "Jess has done nothing but support your career and raise your children while you've been off playing businessman. How dare you stand there and act like she's the problem?" David's face flushed with anger at the challenge to his narrative. "You don't know anything about our marriage, Amy. Jess and I have been living like strangers for years. We stay in the same house, attend the same functions, but there's no connection, no passion, no real partnership." The lies flowed from his mouth with practiced ease, each one more outrageous than the last. I thought of all the business dinners I'd hosted to help his career, all the client wives I'd entertained, all the charity events I'd organized to build his reputation in the community. I remembered nursing him through food poisoning 2 years ago, sitting by his hospital bed when he'd had kidney stones, planning elaborate birthday celebrations that made him feel special and appreciated. But what struck me most was how easily he dismissed the quiet intimacy we'd shared, the small moments that had sustained our marriage through difficult times. Late-night conversations when the children were sick, shared laughter over inside jokes that had developed over decades, the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's rhythms and needs. No passion. Rachel's voice was dangerously quiet as she stepped closer to our little group. I've watched Jess plan surprise trips for your birthday, stay up all night when you had the flu, defend you to people who questioned your business practices. What exactly do you call that? Stephanie shifted uncomfortably, clearly beginning to understand that the narrative David had fed her about our loveless marriage didn't match the reality his own family and friends had witnessed. The confidence she'd displayed during the proposal was wavering as the crowd's hostility became impossible to ignore. Look, David said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when trying to close difficult deals. I know this is hard to understand, but sometimes people grow apart. Jess and I want different things now. She's content with this suburban life, but I need something more exciting, more dynamic. The dismissal of our entire life together as merely suburban revealed everything about how David now viewed our marriage. We'd built this life together, chosen this community, this house, this carefully curated existence that had seemed like success when we were struggling young professionals. Now he was using it as evidence of my inadequacy, proof that I'd failed to evolve along with his expanding ambitions. More exciting, like a 28-year-old interior designer. The words came out of my mouth before I could stop them, sharp and clear in the evening air. How original, David. A midlife crisis with a beautiful young woman. I'm sure no man has ever thought of that before. The sarcasm in my voice seemed to surprise everyone, including myself. I'd spent 2 decades perfecting the art of diplomatic silence, smoothing over David's rough edges with gentle redirection and private conversations. Public confrontation had never been my style, but something about watching him propose to another woman in our backyard had shattered my carefully maintained composure. David's face darkened with anger and embarrassment. Don't be bitter, Jess. This isn't about age or appearance. Stephanie understands my ambitions in a way you never did. She's built her own career, she has her own goals. We're partners in a way you and I never were. The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be devastating. I had subordinated my career to support David's, had chosen to be the supporting player in his success story rather than pursuing my own ambitions. But that choice had been made together, part of a partnership we'd both agreed would benefit our family and his business. Partners, I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. Is that what you call someone who helps you destroy your family? Someone who lets you use your children's anniversary party as the venue for your engagement? That's the kind of partnership you've been looking for. Stephanie's face had gone pale, and I could see her beginning to understand the true cost of her relationship with David. The fantasy he'd sold her about a mutual separation and an amicable divorce was crumbling as she witnessed the real devastation of a family being torn apart in real time. The children will adjust, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Kids are resilient. They'll understand that sometimes adults need to make difficult choices to be happy. Emma's voice cut through the conversation like a knife, sharp with the kind of contempt only teenagers could summon. Is this what happiness looks like to you, Dad? Humiliating Mom in front of everyone she knows. Destroying our family for some woman you've known for 8 months. I hadn't heard Emma approach, but she stood behind me now with Tyler at her side, both of them radiating the kind of protective fury that made my heart break and swell simultaneously. My children, who should have been planning their junior and senior years, were instead defending their mother against their father's public betrayal. Emma, you don't understand. David began, but Tyler cut him off with 16-year-old bluntness. We understand perfectly. Tyler said, his voice cracking slightly but determined. You're leaving us for her. You're breaking up our family because you decided you wanted something different. Don't try to make it sound like you're doing us a favor. The pain in Tyler's voice was devastating, and I watched David's face crumble slightly as he confronted the real cost of his choices. For a moment I thought he might reconsider, might recognize that his pursuit of personal happiness was destroying the people who loved him most. But the moment passed, and David's expression hardened into defensive justification. Sometimes adults have to make choices that seem cruel but are actually necessary, he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when explaining business concepts to people he considered inferior. You'll understand when you're older. The dismissal of his children's pain as mere immaturity was the final straw for me. Every protective instinct I'd developed over 20 years of motherhood exploded into white-hot rage, burning away the last remnants of the diplomatic restraint that had defined our marriage. "Get out," I said, my voice low but carrying across the garden with absolute authority. "Get out of my house, get away from my children, and take your fiancé with you." David's laugh was harsh and incredulous. "Your house, Jess, let's not forget who's been paying the mortgage for the past 20 years. This is my house, my party, my family, and I'll handle this situation however I see fit." The casual assertion of ownership revealed everything about how David viewed our marriage and family. Despite my financial contributions, despite my grandmother's inheritance that had made the down payment possible, despite 20 years of building a home together, he saw everything as fundamentally his to dispose of as he wished. "Actually," I said, my voice steady despite the fury coursing through my veins, "let's talk about who's been paying for what." I reached into my purse and pulled out the velvet box, holding it up so everyone could see. The small container seemed insignificant against the backdrop of our elaborate party, but I could feel the weight of secrets it contained, the power of truth it represented. "Do you know what this is, David?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent garden. "This is ring number 7. The 7th engagement ring you've bought me in the past 7 years. One for each affair I discovered, each time you promised it would never happen again." The crowd's attention focused on the box with laser intensity, and I could feel the shift in energy as people began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple divorce announcement. This was a reckoning 20 years in the making. David's face had gone white, his confident demeanor cracking as he realized the trap he'd walked into. "Jess, don't do this. Whatever you think you know, I know everything," I interrupted, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Miranda from the Miami conference in 2015. Sarah from the New York business trip in 2017. Jennifer, the client who needed so much evening consultation. Rebecca from the downtown office. Maria from the construction site meetings. And now Stephanie, who somehow requires overnight design sessions in the Hamptons." Each name hit David like a physical blow, and I watched his carefully constructed image crumble in real time. The guests stood frozen, horrified fascination keeping them rooted in place as 20 years of secrets spilled out into the open. 7 affairs, 7 rings, 7 times you bought my silence with diamonds and promises. I continued, opening the box to reveal the stunning emerald-cut ring he'd given me just weeks ago. "But this one was different. Wasn't it? This one wasn't gilt jewelry. This was a practice run for the proposal you were planning to give Stephanie." Stephanie's gasp was audible across the garden, and I saw her look down at her own ring with new understanding. The similarity between the stones was unmistakable now that she knew what to look for, the evidence of David's lazy romanticism laid bare for everyone to see. "I've spent 7 years documenting your betrayals," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally stopped pretending to be weak. "Professional appraisals, purchase receipts, hotel bills, credit card statements, text messages, photographs. Everything carefully cataloged and legally preserved." Patricia's sharp intake of breath told me she understood the implications immediately. In Connecticut's divorce courts, evidence of systematic infidelity and financial deception could devastate a cheating spouse's claims to marital assets. "You want to talk about who owns what?" I continued, my 20 years of accumulated rage finally finding its voice. "Let's have that conversation in front of a judge, with lawyers present and all the evidence spread out on the table." David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in our marriage, he had nothing to say, no smooth explanation or charming deflection to escape the consequences of his actions. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of 2 decades worth of unspoken truths. Around us, our anniversary party continued its strange suspended animation, guests too shocked to leave but too uncomfortable to stay. But I wasn't finished. 7 years of careful documentation had led to this moment, and I intended to make every word count. "The engagement ring you just gave Stephanie," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the garden. The one you bought with our joint credit card last week. Consider it a wedding gift from me. Because after tonight, you're going to need all the jewelry you can get to convince women to overlook what kind of man you really are. The devastating precision of my words seemed to physically stagger David, and I watched 20 years of marriage die in his eyes. Not with sadness or regret, but with the cold calculation of someone realizing exactly how much his betrayal was going to cost him. And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of our anniversary party and the shocked faces of everyone we'd pretended to be happy for, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 7 years. Freedom, Part 4. Historical pattern establishment. The next morning arrived with the cruel brightness that follows devastation, sunlight streaming through our bedroom windows to illuminate the remnants of what had once been my marriage. David hadn't come home the night before, disappearing with Stephanie immediately after my revelation, while guests fled our anniversary party like survivors escaping a shipwreck. I'd spent the dark hours before dawn lying awake in our king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling and remembering how it all began. The first affair had been different, wrapped in the kind of desperate romance that made betrayal feel almost understandable. Miranda Castellanos had been a client looking to buy a luxury condo in downtown Hartford, a recently divorced marketing executive with dark hair and expensive taste who needed David's help finding the perfect space to restart her life. What I later learned was that she'd also needed David's help restarting her romantic life, beginning with long business dinners that stretched into intimate evenings at hotel bars. I'd discovered the affair the way most wives do, through a combination of intuition and carelessness. David had become distant and distracted, working later hours and taking more business trips, his phone constantly buzzing with messages he'd check with the secretive intensity of someone protecting valuable secrets. When I'd finally worked up the courage to look through his text messages one Thursday evening while he showered, I'd found months of correspondence that read like a romance novel written by someone with no imagination. Missing you already, can't wait until Miami, and last night was incredible, wish we could stay in bed all weekend, and Jess suspects nothing, we're safe. The casual dismissal of my intelligence in that last message had hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself, the assumption that I was too naive or trusting to notice my husband falling in love with someone else. The confrontation had been messy and painful, full of tears and accusations and desperate promises. David had sworn it meant nothing, that Miranda was just a distraction during a difficult time in our marriage, that he'd never intended for things to go so far. He'd cried actual tears, holding me while he apologized and begged for forgiveness, promising that he'd end things immediately and recommit himself to our family. 2 weeks later, he'd presented me with the first ring. I know I can't undo what I did, he'd said, kneeling beside our bed with a jewelry box in his hands and remorse written across his face. But I want you to know how sorry I am, how much you mean to me, how committed I am to making this right. The ring had been beautiful, a classic solitaire setting with a 2-carat diamond that caught the light like captured stars. More importantly, it had represented hope, the possibility that our marriage could survive his betrayal and emerge stronger on the other side. I'd let him slide it onto my finger, with tears streaming down my face, believing that love could overcome anything if both people were willing to fight for it. What I hadn't understood then was that David's definition of fighting for our marriage involved buying expensive jewelry while continuing to pursue other women, with increasingly sophisticated deception techniques. The second affair had begun less than a year after Miranda, this time with Sarah Chen, a real estate attorney who worked on many of David's commercial deals. The irony that both of David's mistresses shared variations of the same first name wasn't lost on me, though I'd never been sure whether it represented a psychological pattern or simple coincidence. Sarah had been more careful than Miranda, never leaving obvious text message trails or creating email evidence that could be easily discovered. Instead, she and David had communicated through a shared calendar system, disguised as project management, with coded entries like Hartford site inspection and contract review session that actually represented romantic meetings at expensive hotels throughout Connecticut and New York. I'd only discovered this affair through pure chance, when Sarah had called our home phone late one evening looking for David, forgetting that he'd told her he was out of town on business.
The intimacy in her voice, when she'd realized she was speaking to me. The quick cover story about urgent legal documents, the way she'd known exactly which hotel David was supposed to be staying at, had all combined to create a picture I couldn't ignore. The confrontation this time had been different, marked by David's increasing skill at deflection and manipulation. Instead of immediate confession and remorse, he'd spent weeks gaslighting me about my suspicions, suggesting that my jealousy was becoming unhealthy, and my accusations were damaging our marriage more than any affair could. Only when I'd presented him with undeniable evidence, including hotel receipts I'd found in his jacket pocket, had he finally admitted to the relationship. It's different this time, he'd insisted, and I'd been naive enough to believe he meant it was more serious, rather than more carefully hidden. Sarah understands the business in a way you never could. We connect on a professional level that just evolved into something personal. The explanation had been designed to make me feel inadequate rather than betrayed, to suggest that his infidelity was actually a natural consequence of my failure to grow alongside his career. Even his apology had been laced with subtle criticism, implying that a better wife would have prevented his need to seek intellectual stimulation elsewhere. Ring number 2 had been more expensive than the first, a vintage Art Deco setting with a center stone surrounded by smaller diamonds in an intricate pattern that must have cost nearly $10,000. David had presented it with a speech about renewed commitment and deeper appreciation for what we'd built together, but I'd noticed that his remorse seemed more practiced this time, like a performance he'd rehearsed. The pattern that emerged over the next several years was as predictable as it was painful. Each affair followed a similar trajectory: initial attraction to a professional contact, gradual escalation from business meetings to personal relationship, months of careful deception, followed by inevitable discovery, confrontation and confession, tearful promises of reform, and finally an expensive piece of jewelry meant to symbolize our fresh start. Jennifer Walsh had been affair number 3, an interior designer who'd worked on David's office renovation and apparently decided that his home life needed similar attention. Rebecca Morrison had followed 2 years later, a marketing consultant who'd helped launch Parker & Thompson Development's new branding campaign and had somehow extended her services to include David's personal satisfaction. Maria Santos had been the most recent before Stephanie, a project manager who'd coordinated construction on David's largest commercial development and had apparently provided hands-on oversight of more than just building schedules. Each woman had been successful in her own right, professionally accomplished, and financially independent, in ways that made them seem like genuine partners, rather than simple sexual conquests. David had a type, I'd realized, and that type was essentially a younger, more ambitious version of who I'd been when we first met. The pattern suggested that he wasn't looking for affairs so much as auditions for my replacement, testing potential candidates for the role of second Mrs. David Parker. What had made each betrayal particularly devastating was David's increasing creativity with justification. By affair number 4, he'd stopped apologizing for the relationships themselves, and instead began apologizing for my discovery of them, as if my knowledge of his infidelity was the real problem, rather than the infidelity itself. Rebecca Morrison had been accompanied by a lecture about how successful men throughout history had maintained multiple relationships, and how my middle-class upbringing had given me unrealistic expectations about marriage and fidelity. Look at the Kennedys, look at the Roosevelts, he'd said during one particularly painful conversation, as if presidential precedent somehow justified his behavior. Powerful men have complex needs that one woman can't always meet. It doesn't mean I love you less, it just means I need different things from different people. The sophistication of his manipulation had grown along with his success, each affair becoming an opportunity to educate me about my own inadequacies, rather than acknowledge his failures as a husband. By the time Maria Santos entered our lives, David had perfected the art of making his betrayals seem like inevitable consequences of natural law, rather than deliberate choices that destroyed trust and intimacy. Ring number 5 had come with a speech about how European marriages often accommodated such arrangements, and how American Puritanism had created unrealistic expectations that damaged more relationships than they protected. David had somehow convinced himself that his affairs represented a more sophisticated approach to marriage, one that acknowledged human nature rather than fighting against it. "I'm not asking you to like it," he'd said while presenting me with a stunning emerald and diamond ring that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. I'm asking you to understand that this is how successful marriages actually work. We maintain the partnership that matters, while allowing each other the freedom to explore other connections. The language he'd used revealed everything about how David viewed our relationship by that point. I wasn't his wife anymore. I was his business partner, responsible for maintaining the domestic infrastructure that supported his career, while he pursued whatever personal satisfaction he could find elsewhere. The rings weren't apologies, they were payment for services rendered, compensation for my continued participation in a marriage that had become entirely transactional. But what David had never understood was that my acceptance of each ring wasn't forgiveness, it was evidence collection. Every piece of jewelry came with documentation that I'd carefully preserved, purchase receipts, credit card statements, insurance appraisals, and photographs that captured not just the rings themselves, but the circumstances under which they'd been given. I'd also documented each affair with meticulous precision, creating files that tracked David's movements, expenses, and communications with surgical accuracy. My background as a jewelry appraiser had proven invaluable in ways David never suspected. I understood the difference between genuine remorse and calculated manipulation, between authentic gestures and expensive distractions. More importantly, I knew how to evaluate the true worth of what was being offered, and David's rings had become increasingly valuable as his guilt became more expensive to assuage. The sixth affair had been different, marked by David's complete abandonment of even the pretense of discretion. Stephanie Chen had entered our lives through Parker and Thompson Development's expansion into luxury residential design, a brilliant young woman with an MBA from Wharton and a portfolio that impressed even David's most demanding clients. What had started as professional admiration had quickly evolved into personal obsession, with David finding increasingly transparent excuses to work closely with Stephanie on projects that should have required minimal collaboration. "She's revolutionary," he'd gush over dinner, describing Stephanie's innovative approaches to spatial design and client relations with the kind of enthusiasm he'd once reserved for our own relationship. "She understands that modern luxury isn't just about expensive materials, it's about creating experiences that transform how people live." The way David talked about Stephanie revealed his complete emotional investment in a way that previous affairs hadn't. Jennifer, Rebecca, and Maria had been conquests, trophies that proved his continued attractiveness and success. But Stephanie represented something deeper, a genuine connection that threatened the foundation
of our marriage in ways that simple infidelity never had. I'd known from the beginning that this affair would be different, that David wasn't just seeking sexual variety but actively auditioning my replacement. The signs had been impossible to ignore: his sudden interest in contemporary art, his new appreciation for Asian cuisine, his unexplained knowledge of current fashion trends that Stephanie had clearly introduced into his previously predictable aesthetic preferences. The discovery of their relationship had come not through detective work but through David's own carelessness, his increasing inability to maintain the boundaries between his professional and personal lives. When I'd found Stephanie's earring in our car after a supposed client dinner, David hadn't even bothered with elaborate explanations. Instead, he'd simply admitted to the relationship with the kind of relief that suggested he'd been waiting for permission to stop pretending. "This is different, Jess," he'd said, echoing the words he'd used about previous affairs but with a sincerity that made them terrifying rather than insulting. "Stephanie makes me feel like the man I was always supposed to be. We have the same goals, the same vision for success, the same understanding of what life could be." The ring that had followed this confession had been the most expensive yet, a 5-carat masterpiece that represented more money than I'd ever imagined spending on jewelry. But it had also come with conditions that revealed how fundamentally our relationship had changed. David hadn't asked for forgiveness or promised to end the affair. Instead, he'd asked for my cooperation in managing the situation until he could figure out how to transition from our marriage to his future with Stephanie. "I need time to handle this properly," he'd explained while sliding the ring onto my finger with hands that trembled slightly. "The business is at a critical point. The kids are almost through high school and I can't afford the kind of scandal that a messy divorce would create. But I promise you, once everything stabilizes, we'll work out an arrangement that's fair to everyone." The assumption that I would participate in my own replacement, that I would graciously step aside when David's timeline suited his convenience, had been breathtaking in its arrogance. But I'd accepted the ring and agreed to his terms because I'd finally understood exactly what I was dealing with. David hadn't just become a serial cheater, he'd evolved into someone who genuinely believed that his desires justified any amount of collateral damage to the people around him. That night, lying alone in our bed while David spent the weekend in the Hamptons with Stephanie, I'd made the decision that would define the next phase of my life. Instead of continuing to play the role of understanding wife waiting patiently for David's next betrayal, I would begin actively documenting everything that could be used to destroy him when the time came for our marriage to end. The revelation that David was planning to propose to Stephanie hadn't surprised me, but the location and timing of his announcement had exceeded even my expectations for his capacity for cruelty. Using our anniversary party as the venue for his engagement had been a masterstroke of psychological warfare, designed to maximize my humiliation while ensuring that our entire social circle witnessed his transition from husband to bachelor. But David's theatrical sense of timing had also created the perfect opportunity for my own revelation. By gathering everyone who mattered to us in one place, by making his betrayal as public as possible, he'd provided me with an audience for the truth I'd been preparing to tell for 7 years. The morning after our disaster of an anniversary party, I sat in our kitchen with Rachel and Amy, the three of us drinking coffee from cups that David had bought during our 10th anniversary trip to Italy. The irony of using gifts from happier times to discuss the end of my marriage wasn't lost on any of us, but it seemed appropriate somehow, a reminder of how completely David had poisoned even our most cherished memories. "I can't believe you kept all those rings," Amy said, shaking her head in amazement as she examined the collection I'd finally brought out of hiding. "I would have thrown them back in his face after the second affair." "I thought about it," I admitted, running my finger along the edge of ring number 3, the vintage Art Deco setting that had once represented hope for our marriage's recovery. "But then I realized they were evidence, proof of a pattern that any divorce attorney would find very interesting." Rachel picked up ring number 6, the emerald and diamond creation that had accompanied David's request for my cooperation in his affair with Stephanie. "This one alone is worth more than my car," she said quietly. "How much did you say the whole collection is worth?" $180,000, I replied, the number still seeming surreal even though I'd memorized every appraisal report. 7 rings, 7 affairs, 7 years of David buying my silence with increasingly expensive guilt offerings. The documentation spread across our kitchen table told the complete story of David's systematic destruction of our marriage. Bank statements showing purchases at jewelry stores following suspicious travel expenses. Hotel receipts that contradicted his claimed business meetings. Credit card bills that revealed dinners for 2 at romantic restaurants during nights when he'd told me he was working late. Text message printouts that captured conversations David thought he'd deleted. Even photographs I'd taken of him and various women at public events, images that seemed innocent individually but formed a damning pattern when viewed collectively. "This is enough to destroy him in divorce court," Amy said, her voice filled with grim satisfaction. "Connecticut still considers adultery in property division, especially when there's evidence of systematic deception and financial manipulation." I nodded, though revenge wasn't my primary motivation anymore. Somewhere during the long years of collecting evidence and documenting betrayals, my focus had shifted from punishment to protection. I wanted to ensure that Emma and Tyler would be financially secure regardless of David's decisions, and I wanted to guarantee that his serial infidelity wouldn't be rewarded with a favorable divorce settlement. "The question now is what you want to do with all this," Rachel said, gesturing at the evidence covering our table. "You could file for divorce immediately, or you could wait and see if David tries to reconcile after last night's disaster." The suggestion that David might attempt reconciliation seemed laughable after his public proposal to Stephanie, but I understood Rachel's logic. Men like David often panicked when the financial implications of their choices became clear, and his mother Patricia was certainly applying pressure for him to reconsider his dramatic gesture. But I'd moved beyond hoping for reconciliation or dreading divorce. David's proposal to Stephanie had been the final confirmation that our marriage was truly over, not because of any single betrayal, but because of the man he'd become over the past 7 years. The David who'd cried while begging for forgiveness after the first affair no longer existed, replaced by someone who viewed marriage as a contract to be renegotiated whenever his personal desires changed. "I'm done pretending," I said finally, the words carrying more certainty than I'd felt about anything in years. "David made his choice last night, and now I'm going to make mine." The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and liberating in equal measure. For 20 years I'd defined myself primarily as David's wife, measuring my worth by his success and my value by his satisfaction. The prospect of rebuilding my identity as a single woman at 42 was daunting, but it was also exciting in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Part 5. Achievement Recognition Disparity. The weeks that followed our anniversary party disaster revealed just how carefully David had been planning his exit from our marriage while maintaining the illusion of commitment to our family. As I sorted through financial documents with Linda Kowalski, the divorce attorney Rachel had recommended, I discovered a pattern of financial manipulation that extended far beyond his affair-related expenses. "Your husband has been very systematic," Linda observed, spreading bank statements across her mahogany conference table like a prosecutor preparing for trial. "Look at these transfers to his personal account over the past 2 years. Small amounts, never enough to trigger automatic notifications, but they add up to nearly $40,000. The evidence was damning in its methodical precision. David had been skimming money from our joint accounts for months, building a financial foundation for his new life with Stephanie, while leaving me to manage household expenses and children's activities on an increasingly tight budget. When I'd questioned him about our rising credit card balances and diminishing savings, he'd blamed the economy, business fluctuations, and my own spending habits. He's also been paying for significant expenses that aren't showing up in your joint accounts," Linda continued, pointing to gaps in our financial records that told their own story. "The engagement ring he gave Stephanie, for example. That wasn't purchased with any card or account you have access to, which means he has financial resources you're not aware of." The realization that David had been hiding money while criticizing my spending was particularly galling. Just 2 months earlier, he'd lectured me about the cost of Emma's SAT prep courses, suggesting that we couldn't afford the premium program she wanted to attend. Meanwhile, he'd been secretly funding romantic weekends and expensive jewelry for his mistress using money that should have been supporting our family. "What about the house?" I asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the full scope of my financial vulnerability. Linda's expression was grim but not hopeless. "The property is in both your names, and you can prove your grandmother's inheritance provided the down payment. In Connecticut, that gives you significant claim to equity, especially given the documented infidelity. But David's been making payments toward the mortgage from his business account rather than your joint account, which complicates the ownership picture." The legal complexities were staggering, but what struck me most was how deliberately David had been undermining my financial security while maintaining the facade of a committed husband and father. Every joint decision about money, every discussion about budgets and expenses, every concern I'd raised about our diminishing savings had been manipulated to hide his systematic preparation for abandoning our family. "He's been planning this for years," I said, the full scope of David's deception finally becoming clear. Every apology, every promise to change, every expensive ring was just buying him time to position himself for a clean exit. The evidence supported my conclusion in devastating detail. Credit reports showed that David had opened individual accounts I'd never known about, established credit lines that weren't tied to our joint finances, and even purchased a life insurance policy that named Stephanie as the beneficiary, rather than me or our children. The man who'd tearfully promised to recommit to our marriage after each affair had been simultaneously preparing for its destruction with the same methodical planning he brought to his business deals. But Linda's next revelation was the most shocking of all. "Your husband filed preliminary divorce papers 3 weeks ago," she said, sliding a legal document across the table. "He hasn't served them to you yet, but he's been consulting with counsel and preparing his case for much longer than you realized." The papers made for devastating reading, filled with accusations of my emotional unavailability, claims about our sexual incompatibility, and suggestions that I'd been an inadequate partner who'd driven David to seek fulfillment elsewhere. The man who'd publicly proposed to another woman at our anniversary party had somehow positioned himself as the victim of our marriage's failure, the long-suffering husband finally forced to seek happiness with someone who could meet his needs. "This is completely backwards," Amy said when I showed her the documents that evening. "He's the one who cheated 7 times, but he's claiming you were the problem. How is that even legal?" "It's a strategy," Linda had explained during our meeting. "If David can establish that your marriage was dysfunctional before his affairs began, he can argue that his infidelity was a symptom rather than a cause of the relationship's breakdown. It's manipulation disguised as legal positioning." The realization that David had been building a case against me while I'd been trying to save our marriage was like discovering that someone you trusted had been poisoning your food for years. Every conversation we'd had about our relationship problems, every therapy session he'd suggested we attend, every moment of vulnerability I'd shared had been potential ammunition for his eventual legal strategy. "He suggested couples counseling 6 months ago," I told Linda during our follow-up meeting. "I thought he was finally taking our problems seriously, but now I realize he was probably documenting everything I said for his divorce case." Linda nodded grimly. That's unfortunately common in these situations. One spouse suggests therapy while secretly consulting divorce attorneys, using the sessions to gather evidence about their partner's emotional state and relationship complaints. The betrayal ran deeper than infidelity, extending into every aspect of trust and intimacy that marriage was supposed to protect. David hadn't just cheated on me physically, he'd been systematically undermining me emotionally and financially while maintaining the illusion of a husband working to save his marriage. But what David hadn't counted on was my own systematic documentation of his betrayals, evidence that painted a very different picture of our marriage's breakdown. While he'd been consulting lawyers and hiding assets, I'd been collecting proof of his affairs, financial deception, and emotional manipulation with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the truth required careful preservation. "Your evidence changes everything," Linda said as she reviewed the files I'd brought to our second meeting. 7 documented affairs, financial records showing systematic deception, and proof that he's been planning this divorce while publicly committing to reconciliation. This isn't just adultery, it's fraud. The rings that had once symbolized David's guilt and my forgiveness had become the foundation of my legal defense, each piece of jewelry representing not just an affair but a pattern of behavior that any reasonable court would find damning. More importantly, the financial records associated with each ring proved that David had been using our joint resources to fund his betrayals while lying about our family's financial situation. "He's going to be very surprised when he finally serves those papers," Linda continued, a hint of satisfaction in her professional demeanor. "Men like your husband often assume their wives are too emotional or naive to prepare for legal warfare. He has no idea what's coming." The prospect of destroying David in divorce court should have felt satisfying, but instead I found myself mourning the man he'd once been, and the marriage we might have had if he'd chosen differently. The David who'd proposed to me 21 years ago wouldn't have recognized the man who'd systematically betrayed our family while planning his escape to a younger woman. But that David was gone, replaced by someone who viewed marriage as a business arrangement, and family as a liability to be managed rather than a blessing to be cherished. The evidence spread across Linda's conference table told the story of that transformation in brutal detail, charting David's evolution from unfaithful husband to calculating predator who'd used our love against us. "What do you want from this divorce?" Linda asked as our meeting concluded. "Beyond financial security and custody arrangements, what would constitute justice for you?" The question was harder to answer than I'd expected. For years I'd focused on surviving David's betrayals, rather than imagining life beyond them. But sitting in Linda's office, surrounded by evidence of systematic deception and manipulation, I finally understood what I wanted. "I want the truth to matter," I said finally. "I want David to face consequences for his choices instead of being rewarded for his cruelty. And I want my children to understand that love isn't supposed to hurt the people who trust you most." Linda smiled, the expression transforming her stern features into something almost maternal. "I think we can arrange that," she said, already beginning to organize the evidence that would ensure David's carefully planned exit from our marriage became the disaster he deserved. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's greatest skill, his ability to plan and execute complex strategies, would ultimately become the weapon used to destroy him. He'd been so focused on positioning himself for a favorable divorce that he'd created a paper trail documenting his own fraud and deception. 7 rings, 7 affairs, 7 years of careful documentation had led to this moment. David had taught me that marriage could be transactional, that love could be commodified, that trust could be purchased with expensive gestures. Now he was about to learn that transactions worked both ways, and that the price of his betrayals was higher than any ring he'd ever bought. The divorce proceedings that followed our anniversary party catastrophe unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction, each legal maneuver revealing new depths to David's calculated betrayal, while simultaneously exposing the flaws in his supposedly bulletproof strategy. 3 months after he'd publicly proposed to Stephanie in our backyard, David sat across from me in Linda Kowalski's conference room, looking like a man who'd finally realized that his victims were capable of fighting back. The transformation in his appearance was startling. Gone was the confident real estate mogul who'd commanded rooms with easy charm and expensive suits. The David facing me now looked haggard and desperate, his usually perfect hair showing gray roots he'd apparently forgotten to color, his designer clothing wrinkled in a way that suggested he'd been sleeping in his car rather than the luxury hotel where he'd been staying since leaving our home. "This is ridiculous, Jess," he said, his voice carrying a note of hysteria I'd never heard before. "You're trying to destroy me over mistakes that happened years ago. Everyone makes mistakes in marriage. That doesn't mean I deserve to lose everything I've worked for." Linda didn't look up from the documents spread before her as she responded with the kind of professional coldness that made opposing attorneys tremble.
Your client signed papers, claiming the marriage was irretrievably broken due to his wife's emotional unavailability and sexual dysfunction. Now he wants to characterize 7 documented affairs as mistakes rather than deliberate choices. Which narrative would he prefer to present to the judge? David's attorney, Marcus Webb, was an expensive shark who specialized in protecting wealthy men from the financial consequences of their domestic disasters. But even Webb looked uncomfortable as he reviewed the evidence Linda had assembled, the systematic documentation of financial fraud and emotional manipulation that painted his client as a predator rather than a victim. The affair allegations are contested, Webb said weakly, though we all knew the evidence was overwhelming. My client maintains that the marriage was effectively over when these relationships began, and that Mrs. Parker was aware of and tacitly approved of the arrangements. The lie was so audacious that I actually laughed, a sound that seemed to physically recoil David. Tacitly approved. I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. Is that what you call accepting expensive jewelry after discovering each betrayal? Because I have a different interpretation of those transactions. Linda opened a file and began laying out photographs of the 7 rings, each one accompanied by professional appraisal documents and purchase receipts that told their own devastating story. Ring number 1, purchased 3 days after Mrs. Parker discovered your client's affair with Miranda Castellanos. Value $15,000. Ring number 2, purchased 1 week after the discovery of his relationship with Sarah Chen. Value $22,000. She continued through the entire collection, each ring representing an escalation in both infidelity and attempted bribery that painted David as someone who believed any betrayal could be forgiven if the price was high enough. By the time Linda reached ring number 7, the emerald-cut masterpiece that had cost $35,000, David's face had gone completely white. The total value of these guilt offerings is $180,000, Linda concluded. All purchased with marital funds, after each documented affair, all presented as symbols of remorse and renewed commitment. This isn't evidence of Mrs. Parker's approval, it's evidence of systematic manipulation and financial abuse. Webb shuffled through his papers desperately, clearly searching for some angle that could minimize the damage his client had inflicted on his own case. These were gifts freely given, and freely accepted, he argued. They represent my client's genuine desire to repair the marriage after temporary lapses in judgment. Temporary lapses, Linda's voice could have frozen fire. 7 affairs over 7 years, each one more elaborate and expensive to conceal than the last. Your client has spent the past decade treating his marriage like a business contract that could be renegotiated whenever his personal desires changed. The financial evidence was equally damning, showing a pattern of deception that extended far beyond simple infidelity. David had been systematically siphoning money from our joint accounts, while claiming we couldn't afford basic family expenses, had hidden assets and income streams that should have been disclosed, and had even attempted to change beneficiaries on life insurance policies without my knowledge or consent. Your client has been planning this divorce for at least 2 years, Linda continued, spreading bank statements and legal documents across the table like a prosecutor, presenting evidence of premeditated murder. He filed preliminary papers while publicly promising to work on the marriage, opened secret accounts while claiming financial hardship, and purchased an engagement ring for his current mistress, using funds from the children's college savings accounts. That last revelation hit David like a physical blow, and I watched him realize that his supposedly careful financial planning had actually created a paper trail that documented every aspect of his fraud. The man who'd built a successful real estate empire through meticulous attention to detail had somehow overlooked the fact that electronic banking and credit card transactions created permanent records of his betrayals. The engagement ring he presented to Miss Chen was purchased using funds illegally, transferred from accounts designated for Emma and Tyler's education, Linda explained, her voice taking on the righteous anger that made her such a formidable advocate. He literally stole from his own children to buy jewelry for the woman he was planning to marry after abandoning his family. Webb looked like he was contemplating early retirement as he attempted damage control. Those were temporary transfers to cover cash flow issues in my client's business accounts. The money would have been replaced once certain deals closed. Which deals? Linda asked with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Because we've subpoenaed Parker and Thompson Development's financial records, and they show consistent profitability throughout the period in question. Your client's cash flow problems were entirely self-created through his expensive affair maintenance costs. The revelation that David's business was thriving while he claimed financial hardship at home was the final nail in his legal coffin. He'd been living a double life so completely that he'd forgotten which lies he'd told to which audience, creating contradictions that made his testimony worthless and his credibility non-existent. What do you want? David asked suddenly, his voice cracking with desperation. What will it take to make this go away quietly? The question revealed everything about how David viewed the legal system and his own accountability. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence of systematic betrayal and fraud, he believed that money could solve any problem and silence any inconvenient truth. "That's not how this works," Linda replied coldly. "You can't buy your way out of the consequences of systematically destroying your family. The court will determine an appropriate division of assets based on your documented misconduct and financial manipulation." What followed was a negotiation that looked more like a surrender, with David's carefully constructed plans crumbling under the weight of his own documented deceptions. The man who'd spent years positioning himself for a favorable divorce found himself facing the loss of nearly everything he'd worked to protect. The house would remain mine, along with primary custody of Emma and Tyler. David's business assets would be divided according to Connecticut's infidelity provisions, which heavily favored the wronged spouse when systematic adultery could be proven. The retirement accounts he'd been protecting through his secret financial maneuvering would be split in my favor, and he'd be responsible for replacing every penny he'd stolen from the children's college funds. "This is insane," David protested as the terms became clear. "You're talking about destroying my entire life over relationships that had nothing to do with you. I never asked you to stay married to me. I gave you opportunities to leave gracefully." The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity, but it also revealed the core of David's sociopathy. In his mind, his affairs weren't betrayals, but opportunities he'd generously provided for me to exit our marriage. The expensive rings weren't guilt offerings, but severance packages that should have purchased my grateful departure from his life. Opportunities to leave gracefully. I finally spoke, my voice steady despite the rage coursing through my veins. "Like the opportunity you gave me at our anniversary party, when you proposed to another woman in front of our children. That kind of graceful exit." David's face contorted with frustration, and what might have been genuine confusion about why I wasn't more appreciative of his handling of the situation. "I thought it would be cleaner this way," he said. "Rip the bandage off quickly instead of letting things drag on for months." The casual cruelty of reducing our 20-year marriage to a bandage that needed removal showed me exactly who David had become, and more importantly, who he'd probably always been underneath the charm and romantic gestures that had once swept me off my feet. "Clean for whom?" I asked. "Clean for you and Stephanie,
Who got to start your new life without the messy complications of honest communication. Clean for Emma and Tyler, who got to watch their father publicly abandon them for a woman half his age." For the first time during the entire proceeding, David looked genuinely ashamed. The mention of our children seemed to penetrate his self-justification in a way that discussions of financial fraud and systematic infidelity had not. But even his shame was calculated, designed to evoke sympathy rather than acknowledge genuine wrongdoing. "I never wanted to hurt the kids," he said quietly. "They'll understand when they're older that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices to find happiness." "No," I replied with absolute certainty. "They'll understand that their father chose his own immediate gratification over their emotional security and their mother's well-being. They'll understand that marriage vows meant nothing to you and that love was just a word you used to control the people around you." The final settlement was signed 3 hours later, with David agreeing to terms that left him with a fraction of what he'd planned to retain and me with resources sufficient to rebuild my life according to my own vision rather than his expectations. The 7 rings that had once symbolized my humiliation became the foundation of my financial independence, their value covering legal fees and providing seed money for the new life I was finally free to create. As we left the law office, David made one last attempt at reconciliation, catching my arm in the parking lot with the kind of desperate intensity that suggested he was finally understanding the true cost of his choices. "It doesn't have to end like this," he said, his voice carrying echoes of the man I'd once loved. "We could still work something out, find a way to co-parent peacefully without all this legal warfare." I looked at him for a long moment, studying the face that had once been the center of my world and trying to find any trace of the person who'd promised to love me forever at our wedding 20 years earlier. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who viewed relationships as transactions and love as a renewable resource that could be redistributed whenever circumstances changed. "You're right," I said finally. "It didn't have to end like this. You had 7 opportunities over 7 years to choose our marriage over your affairs. You had countless chances to recommit to our family instead of systematically betraying us. Every expensive ring you bought was another chance to actually change instead of just managing the consequences of your choices." David opened his mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. "But you chose Stephanie over Emma and Tyler when you used their college money to buy her an engagement ring. You chose your own image over our family's well-being when you turned our anniversary party into your engagement announcement. And you chose greed over integrity when you spent years hiding assets while claiming we couldn't afford basic family expenses. I pulled my arm free from his grasp and walked toward my car, the 7 rings now safely locked in a bank vault along with all the other evidence of his systematic destruction of our marriage. This is exactly how it had to end, I called over my shoulder. Because this is who you chose to become. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail, elegantly printed on ivory cardstock and addressed to the Parker family in flowing script. David and Stephanie were planning a destination wedding in Tuscany, a romantic European ceremony that would allow them to start their marriage surrounded by beauty and history rather than the wreckage of the family David had abandoned. I threw the invitation in the trash without opening it, then spent the afternoon planting roses in the garden where David had once proposed to another woman at our anniversary party. Emma and Tyler helped me choose the varieties, and we selected colors that reminded us of hope rather than heartbreak: bright yellows for new beginnings, soft pinks for gentle love, and deep purples for the kind of strength that comes from surviving betrayal. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if David's departure had removed a weight I hadn't realized we'd been carrying. Emma was thriving in her senior year, her confidence restored by watching her mother refuse to be destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. Tyler had found his footing as well, his natural resilience strengthened by the knowledge that some people fight for what matters rather than simply accepting defeat. As for me, I was learning to define myself as something other than David's victim or David's wife. At 42, I was finally free to discover who Jessica Parker could become when she wasn't spending all her energy managing someone else's betrayals and supporting someone else's dreams. The 7 rings remained in their bank vault, no longer symbols of humiliation but evidence of survival, proof that love could endure even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. They represented not David's power to hurt me but my power to document truth and demand accountability. And sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and the children were asleep, I would remember the woman who'd accepted that first ring with tears of gratitude and forgiveness. She'd been naive and trusting, believing that love could overcome anything if both people were willing to fight for it. She'd been wrong about David, but she'd been right about love. It could overcome anything, even the kind of betrayal that seemed designed to destroy it completely. It just required fighting for yourself rather than fighting for someone who'd already chosen to walk away. The anniversary party that had ended my marriage had also begun my real life, and that seemed like a fair trade for someone who'd finally learned the difference between love and transaction, between forgiveness and enablement, between hope and delusion. David had taught me that some things could be bought with expensive jewelry and smooth apologies, but he'd also taught me that some things were worth more than any price he was willing to pay. My self-respect, my children's well-being, and my belief in authentic love had proven to be non-negotiable, priceless in ways that even 7 beautiful rings couldn't diminish. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I stood in the same backyard where David had once destroyed our marriage, but the space bore no resemblance to the scene of that devastating anniversary party. The pavilion had been transformed into an art studio, its elegant arches now framing easels and canvases instead of crystal chandeliers and guilty consciences. Sunlight streamed through the windows I'd installed, illuminating the jewelry design workspace where I'd rediscovered the passion David had convinced me to abandon when we'd married 20 years earlier. The business cards on my desk read Jessica Williams Designs in elegant script, my maiden name reclaimed along with my professional identity. Heritage Gems and Appraisals had welcomed me back not as the grateful former employee seeking refuge, but as a master craftsperson whose years away had only deepened her understanding of what made beauty truly valuable. My designs had evolved beyond simple technical skill into something more profound, each piece telling stories of resilience and transformation that resonated with women who understood that survival could be its own art form. Emma stood at the kitchen island, her acceptance letter to Yale spread before her like a treasure map leading to futures David had tried to steal from her. The early admission to her dream school had come with a scholarship generous enough to cover expenses without touching the college fund David had raided for Stephanie's engagement ring, money that court-ordered restitution had restored with interest that exceeded the original amount. Professor Matthews wants to feature your work in the freshman exhibition, Emma announced, her voice bright with pride as she reviewed the email on her laptop. Apparently your Phoenix collection has been making waves in academic circles as an example of jewelry as narrative art. The Phoenix collection had been my first major project after rebuilding my studio, 7 pieces that transformed the pain of David's systematic betrayals into something beautiful and meaningful. Each design incorporated elements from the rings he'd given me, the original stones reset in settings that spoke to rebirth rather than guilt, freedom rather than purchase. The centerpiece was a stunning necklace that combined all 7 diamonds into a cascade of light that seemed to move with its own inner fire, a visual representation of how individual traumas could be transformed into collective strength. Tyler bounded through the kitchen with the easy confidence of a 16-year-old who'd learned that family loyalty meant more than biological connection, his basketball uniform bearing the name Williams instead of Parker at his own request. The legal name change had been his idea, a symbolic rejection of David's legacy that had surprised me with its emotional impact. Watching my son choose to carry my family's name instead of his father's had felt like vindication in ways I hadn't expected. Coach says the recruiters from UConn are coming to Friday's game, Tyler announced, grabbing an apple from the bowl Rachel had brought during her morning visit. Can you believe Dad's missing all of this? I mean, I know he made his choice, but still. The casual reference to David's absence carried no bitterness, just the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone who'd learned to distinguish between fathers who showed up and men who simply shared DNA. David's sporadic attempts at contact had dwindled after the first year, his new life in California with Stephanie apparently too demanding to accommodate regular communication with the children he'd abandoned. Some people don't know how to hold on to what matters, I replied, the words carrying wisdom earned through hard experience rather than theoretical understanding. But that doesn't diminish what you've accomplished or what you're capable of achieving. Rachel appeared in the doorway with her usual perfect timing, her arms loaded with groceries for the dinner party we'd planned to celebrate Emma's acceptance and Tyler's championship game victory. Our friendship had deepened during the divorce proceedings into something that felt more like family than many blood relationships, built on shared values and genuine affection rather than obligation or convenience. David's engagement announcement is trending on the Hartford Business Journal website, Rachel announced with the deadpan delivery she reserved for particularly absurd developments. Apparently Stephanie's pregnancy makes their love story even more inspiring to the business community. The news that David and Stephanie were expecting their first child together should have stung, but instead I felt only a distant pity for the unborn baby who would grow up with a father incapable of prioritizing anyone's needs over his own immediate desires. Emma and Tyler had learned that lesson the hard way, but they'd also learned that they were strong enough to thrive without constant validation from someone who'd proven himself unworthy of their trust. I hope she understands what she's signing up for, Emma said with the wisdom of someone who'd watched her father's pattern of behavior from the inside. Marriage to Dad comes with an expiration date that's directly tied to how long you're willing to pretend his needs are more important than everyone else's. The sophisticated psychological insight in Emma's observation reminded me that my children had gained invaluable education during the divorce proceedings, learning to recognize manipulation and emotional abuse in ways that would protect them throughout their lives. They'd seen their mother refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, had watched me fight for principles rather than simply surrender to convenience, and had internalized lessons about self-respect that no classroom could have taught them. Amy arrived with her twins and husband in tow, their monthly dinner tradition having evolved from obligation into genuine celebration over the 2 years since David's departure. My sister's initial shock at my transformation from accommodating wife to fierce advocate had given way to deep admiration for someone who'd found strength she'd never known she possessed. The gallery in Soho wants to discuss representation, Amy announced, producing a business card from her purse with the theatrical flourish she reserved for particularly exciting news. Apparently your work is creating quite a buzz among collectors who appreciate jewelry with deeper meaning than simple luxury. The possibility of New York representation felt surreal but achievable, a natural progression from the regional success I'd built through word-of-mouth recommendations and social media marketing. My client base had grown organically among women, who understood that jewelry could tell stories more powerful than any marketing campaign, pieces that celebrated survival rather than simply displaying wealth. The appointment is next week, Amy continued, her excitement infectious. I've already researched the neighborhood and found 3 restaurants within walking distance that serve decent food, because we both know you'll forget to eat if I don't plan ahead. The familiar teasing carried undertones of respect that had been absent from our relationship during my marriage to David, when Amy's concern for my well-being had been tempered by frustration at my willingness to accept unacceptable treatment. Now our sister bond had deepened into mutual admiration between two women who'd learned to define themselves by their own standards rather than external expectations. Patricia Parker had been notably absent from our lives since the divorce settlement, her occasional awkward phone calls clearly motivated by grandmother guilt rather than genuine interest in maintaining relationships with Emma and Tyler. The woman who'd once criticized my middle-class background for being insufficient for her son's ambitions had apparently found Stephanie's wealthy family more acceptable, despite their daughter's role in destroying David's previous marriage. Grandmother Pat sent another check for Tyler's birthday, Emma announced, producing an envelope that had arrived with no accompanying note or personal message. Same amount as last year, still no actual acknowledgement that he's becoming an actual person with interests and achievements. The mechanical nature of Patricia's financial gestures revealed everything about how the Parker family approached relationships, viewing emotional connections as transactions that could be maintained through periodic payments rather than sustained engagement. Tyler had learned to cash the checks without expecting anything deeper, a practical approach that protected him from disappointment while acknowledging the reality of his paternal family's limitations. Linda Kowalski had become more than our divorce attorney over the past 2 years, evolving into a friend whose professional expertise had been matched by personal warmth during the most difficult period of our lives. Her occasional check-ins had helped me navigate the practical challenges of rebuilding life as a single mother while establishing a new career, advice that extended far beyond legal obligations into the realm of genuine mentorship. Linda called this afternoon, I told the gathered family as we prepared dinner together in the kitchen that had once felt like a battlefield during David's increasingly erratic final year. The California Family Court has upheld the child support modifications, which means David's reduced income claims won't affect Emma and Tyler's college funding. The legal victory was small but significant, another confirmation that David's attempts to minimize his financial responsibilities through strategic career changes would not be permitted to impact his children's futures. His decision to leave Parker and Thompson Development for a startup position in Los Angeles had been transparently designed to reduce his documented income, but courts had proven surprisingly sophisticated in recognizing such manipulations. He's probably regretting the decision to move across the country about now, Rachel observed with the satisfaction of someone who'd watched justice unfold in real time. Turns out abandoning your business partnership and your children for a younger woman doesn't automatically lead to improved life circumstances. The dinner conversation flowed around topics that had nothing to do with David's choices or their consequences, my family's emotional landscape no longer dominated by the need to process his latest betrayal or anticipate his next manipulation. Emma discussed her plans for summer internships at museums and galleries. Tyler shared his excitement about advanced placement courses that would challenge his academic abilities, and Amy updated us on her own career developments in pharmaceutical research. The absence of drama felt revolutionary after years of walking on eggshells around David's volatile moods and unpredictable decisions. Our home had become a sanctuary, where honesty was valued over harmony, where problems were addressed directly rather than managed through elaborate accommodation strategies designed to prevent explosive confrontations. I never thought I'd say this, Emma admitted as we cleared the dinner dishes, but I'm grateful for what happened at the anniversary party. I know it was horrible at the time, but watching you refuse to accept Dad's treatment taught me things about self-respect that I'll carry for the rest of my life. The mature perspective in Emma's reflection showed me that my decision to fight for dignity rather than simply accept defeat had been justified not just for my own well-being, but for the lessons it provided to my children about what they should expect from relationships throughout their lives. Tyler nodded in agreement, his usual teenage reserve dropping away as he joined the conversation with unexpected emotional intelligence. Dad always made it seem like you were the problem, like you weren't fun enough or supportive enough or whatever he needed you to be. But watching you build this new life showed me that the problem was never you. It was him expecting everyone else to change so he didn't have to. The psychological insight in Tyler's observation revealed how much he'd learned from witnessing our family's transformation, understanding that healthy relationships required mutual respect and shared responsibility rather than one person's complete accommodation of another person's demands. Besides, Tyler continued with a grin that reminded me of my own father's mischievous humor. Your jewelry business is way cooler than Dad's real estate stuff. You actually create beautiful things instead of just moving money around and calling it success. The comparison between my creative work and David's transactional approach to life highlighted differences that had probably existed throughout our marriage but had been obscured by my willingness to support his ambitions at the expense of my own fulfillment.
Building something meaningful had proven more satisfying than simply facilitating someone else's definition of success. Rachel's departure that evening included her usual offer to help with gallery preparation or business development, her marketing expertise proving invaluable as my client base expanded beyond local referrals into regional recognition. The friendship that had sustained me through David's systematic betrayals had evolved into a professional partnership that benefited both our businesses while maintaining the personal connection that made collaboration feel natural rather than forced. "The Phoenix collection is going to change everything," Rachel predicted as she gathered her coat and purse. "You're not just making jewelry anymore, you're creating legacy pieces that tell stories about resilience and transformation. That's exactly what the art world has been waiting for." The possibility that my work could achieve broader recognition felt both exciting and surreal, a future I'd never imagined during the years when my identity had been entirely defined by my role as David's wife and support system. The woman who'd accepted expensive gilt rings with grateful tears bore little resemblance to the artist who now created jewelry that celebrated strength rather than purchasing forgiveness. As Emma and Tyler settled into their evening routines, homework and college preparations replacing the anxiety and conflict that had once dominated our household dynamics, I walked through the house that had finally become truly mine. The formal living room where Patricia had once lectured me about family dignity now displayed my jewelry designs alongside Emma's photography and Tyler's basketball trophies, a gallery of our shared achievements rather than careful curation designed to impress visitors. The master bedroom where David had once planned his affairs while lying next to me had been completely redecorated, the heavy furniture and dark colors he'd preferred replaced with light woods and soft fabrics that created an atmosphere of peace rather than dramatic sophistication. The safe where I'd once hidden evidence of his betrayals now contained business documents and financial records that represented security rather than survival, insurance policies and investment accounts that would protect my children's futures regardless of their father's decisions. The garden where David had proposed to Stephanie during our anniversary party had been transformed into a meditation space surrounded by the roses Emma, Tyler and I had planted together, varieties chosen for their meaning rather than their appearance. The Phoenix roses bloomed in shades of orange and red that seemed to glow in the evening light, their resilience during harsh winters serving as daily reminders that beauty could emerge from the most challenging circumstances. Standing at the kitchen window as twilight settled over the landscape we'd reclaimed and redefined, I reflected on the journey that had led from devastating public humiliation to genuine personal transformation. The 7 rings that had once symbolized my willingness to accept the unacceptable now represented documentation of survival, evidence that love could endure even systematic attempts to destroy it. David's final attempt at contact had come 6 months earlier, a carefully worded email that managed to be simultaneously apologetic and self-serving, expressing regret for how things ended while avoiding any acknowledgement of the choices that had led to our divorce. His request for closure and mature co-parenting had revealed his continued inability to understand that some damage could not be repaired through eloquent communication and good intentions. I'd responded with professional courtesy rather than personal engagement, forwarding the message to Linda for legal review before sending a brief reply that acknowledged his communication without providing the emotional absolution he was clearly seeking. The woman who'd once desperately wanted David's approval had been replaced by someone who understood that his opinion of me was irrelevant to my well-being or my children's futures. The business card on my kitchen counter confirmed the New York gallery appointment Amy had arranged, a meeting that could represent the next phase of professional growth for Jessica Williams Designs. The Phoenix collection had attracted attention from collectors and critics who understood that jewelry could be art, that personal adornment could tell stories more powerful than simple luxury display. But regardless of what opportunities emerged from that meeting, I'd already achieved the most important transformation of all. The woman who'd stood frozen while her husband proposed to another woman at their anniversary party had evolved into someone who created beauty from betrayal, who built strength from systematic destruction, who chose dignity over comfort and authenticity over acceptance. Emma called goodnight from her bedroom, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd learned that love meant respect rather than accommodation, that healthy relationships required mutual care rather than one-sided sacrifice. Tyler's laughter echoed from his room as he video-called friends who appreciated his humor and loyalty, young men who would grow up understanding that character mattered more than charm, and that integrity was more attractive than manipulation. The house settled into evening quiet, the peaceful atmosphere a stark contrast to the tension and anxiety that had once characterized our family dynamics. No one was walking on eggshells around volatile moods, or carefully managing conversations to avoid triggering explosive reactions. We'd learn to be ourselves rather than carefully curated versions designed to prevent someone else's disappointment or rage. The 7 rings remained in their bank vault, no longer symbols of humiliation but evidence of survival, proof that systematic betrayal could be documented, and justice could be achieved through careful preparation and professional expertise. They represented not David's power to hurt me but my power to refuse unacceptable treatment and demand accountability from people who'd chosen to cause harm. And in the quiet moments before sleep, surrounded by the life I'd built from the wreckage of a marriage that had become transaction disguised as love, I understood that the anniversary party that had destroyed my old life had also created space for something infinitely better. David had taught me the difference between love and manipulation, between partnership and control, between forgiveness and enablement. Most importantly, he taught me that some things were worth more than any price he was willing to pay, that dignity and self-respect were non-negotiable, and that authentic love required the courage to demand better rather than simply accept whatever was offered. The Phoenix collection would soon hang in a Soho gallery, beautiful jewelry created from the ashes of betrayal, art that celebrated transformation rather than simply displaying wealth. But the real masterpiece was the life I'd built for myself and my children, an existence based on genuine values rather than performance, integrity rather than image, love rather than transaction. David had given me 7 rings over 7 years, expensive attempts to purchase silence and forgiveness for systematic betrayals. In return, I'd given him the greatest gift possible, the truth about who he really was, and the consequences of choices he'd made freely. It seemed like a fair trade for someone who'd finally learned the difference between love and ownership, between partnership and possession, between marriage and imprisonment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.